Now here's our first story called Gut Check. On a sunny spring morning in 2021, 16-year-old Sabrina Blessing jolted awake inside of her Boston home with a twisting pain in her stomach. It felt as if her whole belly was being squeezed and wrung out like a wet towel. And pretty soon, the pain gave way to nausea, and Sabrina jumped for the trash can near her bedside. She vomited just as another searing pain wrenched her insides. Sabrina had been dealing with these stomach pains for the last 2 weeks. They would come on sharp and sudden, and then vanish in a matter of minutes. The first time she felt it, she thought it might be food poisoning. But the pain kept coming back day after day, getting worse each time and also lasting longer each time. This morning was the worst one yet. She had begun telling herself that, maybe she had the flu. But now, she wasn't so sure. When the vomiting finally subsided, Sabrina put the trash can back on the floor and flopped back onto her bed. She closed her eyes, feeling absolutely miserable. Her sinuses were full of snot and bile, and her forehead was damp with sweat, and she knew she looked as ragged as she felt. This was a disaster. Sabrina didn't know how she'd make it to school today, and she was terrified about what would happen if she didn't go. She'd just begun dating a new guy, and he was a star player on the football team, and every girl at school had a crush on him. And so Sabrina's mind raced with visions of him being surrounded by a bunch of cheerleaders, all trying to get his attention. The thought of that made her stomach clench all over again, but Sabrina fought through it and actually struggled out of her bed. Somehow, she made it to the bathroom, and there she began to brush her hair and to get ready for the day. However, just a minute later, the nausea once again overwhelmed her. Sabrina dropped her hairbrush and dashed to the toilet. There, she hunched over in pain, her stomach tightening up like a fist. A moment later, her mom knocked on the door and peeked inside. Sabrina sort of moaned, but told her mom she was okay. She said she was going to tough it out and go to school. Then she shakily got to her feet, but the second she stood up, she felt so lightheaded she began to fall over. Her mom rushed inside and caught her daughter just in time. She told Sabrina that school would have to wait. This had gone on long enough. She was taking Sabrina to the emergency room. When Sabrina arrived at the ER, a doctor examined her, took some blood, and then asked for a urine sample so they could run some tests. And thankfully, it all came back normal. So Sabrina asked him if she could go to school now. But the doctor shook his head, no. He said he wanted to do an ultrasound of Sabrina's abdomen, just to be sure nothing was wrong with any of her internal organs. Sabrina sighed and laid back in her hospital bed. Then she began to twirl her hair around her finger while she waited for a technician to come into her cubby in the ER with an ultrasound machine. And as she laid there, all she could think about were all the things that could go wrong with her new relationship if she didn't get to school. What if another girl did catch her boyfriend's attention? And what if she was actually sick here? Would he still want to be with her? And then Sabrina started thinking, well, wait, what if she was really sick? She had tried hard to kind of deny it, the idea that something could really be wrong with her beyond just an ordinary stomach flu. But now as she sat here, she started thinking, how bad was this really? Could her life be in danger? Suddenly, Sabrina's heart was racing with anxiety. She twirled her hair around her finger faster and faster until it was in a big giant tangle around her hand. Her mind was going a mile a minute. But if there was any relief, it was that Sabrina did not have to wait very long for her ultrasound. Just a few minutes later, the tech came in, squeezed some cold gel in her stomach, and began the ultrasound. Sabrina was glad for the distraction as the tech moved the wand across her belly, the screen flickering with shifting shapes. A minute later, the tech called the doctor in, and he glanced at the ultrasound screen. He told Sabrina that everything looked normal, and relief immediately washed over her. The doctor said he didn't really know what was wrong, but if it was a virus, it should pass through her system soon enough. But in the meantime, he was going to prescribe her with a few medications to help manage the pain and discomfort. First, he was giving her prescription-strength ibuprofen, which was more potent than anything she could get over the counter. But because painkillers that strong can cause stomach irritation, he was also prescribing some medicine to protect her stomach lining and reduce the nausea. Sabrina thanked him and took some deep breaths to calm herself down. She told herself this would all be over in a few days and everything would be back to normal. However, the medicine didn't help, and a few days later, Sabrina was curled up on the couch in her living room, hugging her stomach. The pain hadn't let up all day. Earlier that morning, she'd felt good enough to go to school, But halfway through her first class, the familiar twisting pain erupted in her stomach, and she had to run immediately to the nurse's office. Her mom had left work to come take her home. Sabrina moaned and squeezed her eyes shut as her mother hurried into the living room with a glass of water and the extra-strength ibuprofen tablets. Sabrina reached for them and downed the pills, hoping the stabbing sensation would go away soon. But the throbbing kept spreading through her belly, and eventually she cried out for her mother again, who came rushing back into the living room to see what was the matter. Sabrina could barely choke out the words, but she told her mom it felt like the ibuprofen was actually making her stomach feel worse. Now she thought she was going to throw up again. Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed the trash can by the end table. Her mother told her to hang tight. She stood up and raced towards the kitchen and came back with the bottle of anti-nausea medication. She told Sabrina to take one. This would help calm her stomach after the ibuprofen. Her mom shook a pill out of the bottle and handed it to Sabrina. Sabrina hesitated. The last pill had only made things worse, and so she was weary of taking something else. But then Sabrina's stomach twisted horribly again, and so she just looked up at her mom, gave her a thin smile, took the pill, and popped it into her mouth. But once her mom had left the room, Sabrina spit the pill back out. She didn't know why, but she was sure the medication wasn't helping. She told herself that she could just, tough it out and fight through this thing, and soon everything would be better. 1 week later, Sabrina gritted her teeth as she slowly walked across the dark emergency room parking lot beside her mother. It was long after midnight. Every movement she made sent a new jolt of pain through her stomach. Her condition had not gotten better, and tonight, when she was still in bed, she had suddenly woken up with horrible pain in her stomach. The pain was very sharp and deep, like her whole stomach was seizing up. She'd asked her mom to take her back to the ER, and now every step across the parking lot felt like a stab in her side. By the time they reached the hospital doors, Sabrina was barely able to stand, much less walk. Quickly, a nurse put her in a wheelchair and took her back to a cubicle in the ER. Once they were there, Sabrina's mom helped her crawl onto the hospital bed. Then the nurse explained that the doctor would be in soon, but for now, they would do another ultrasound, and they would also test her for sexually transmitted diseases. Sabrina and her mother nodded. 30 minutes later, a different doctor than the one who treated her last time stepped into the cubicle. He told Sabrina that her STD test had come back negative. Then he asked if Sabrina's meds had made any difference in her pain levels over the past week. Sabrina shook her head and said no, explaining that the extra-strength ibuprofen hadn't helped. If anything, it actually had made her pain worse. And after that first time having that horrible adverse reaction to the ibuprofen, or so she thought, she had been too afraid to take any of the other medicines in fear that they too would cause more pain. So she had not been taking the anti-nausea pills or the meds for her stomach lining. Upon hearing this, the doctor looked sort of puzzled. He told Sabrina that it didn't seem like she was having an adverse reaction to the meds, and it really didn't seem like there was anything seriously wrong with her stomach. The only way to get past this was to go through it, and those pills were supposed to help her endure the discomfort. Sabrina smiled and said okay, but inside, she was fuming. It took everything she had not to scream and pull out her hair. As soon as she was discharged, she told her mother they needed to find another doctor, one who would actually help. One week later, pediatrician Dr. Kenny Huang introduced himself to his new patient, Sabrina. Sabrina's mom had brought her into his hospital in Boston after 2 trips to their local emergency room did not resolve Sabrina's stomach pain. Sabrina explained to him that her pain seemed to be getting worse and more frequent. Dr. Huang could see she was on the verge of tears as she spoke, and so he promised her he would help them get to the bottom of this. Dr. Huang asked Sabrina to lie back on the table. He was going to press around her abdomen to see what was triggering her pain. Sabrina sighed. She said she'd been through this already, and none of the doctors had said anything was wrong with her. Dr. Huang gave her a reassuring pat on her shoulder. He knew how frustrating this was for her, but he needed to check for himself. Maybe he'd find something that the others hadn't. Sabrina nodded and then followed Dr. Huang's instructions. After she laid down, he began gently pressing his fingertips into her abdomen, searching for a tender spot. Sabrina stayed quiet during the exam, but the doctor noticed her wincing every time he pressed into her stomach. It seemed like the whole area was sensitive. It did not seem like the pain was originating from one single spot. When he was done, he asked Sabrina to try to describe what she actually felt inside of her abdomen. Sabrina looked at him skeptically. like she didn't trust Dr. Huang was even going to believe her. Sensing this, Dr. Huang grabbed his clipboard and promised the teenager that he was listening and was even going to take notes. Sabrina explained how severe her pain was becoming. Each episode was an 8 out of 10 at this point in terms of pain. It would come on suddenly and was so intense she would vomit. Once she threw up, the twisting feeling usually subsided a little. In total, the spasms usually lasted about 15 minutes, but sometimes they were longer, and those longer episodes were absolute agony. Dr. Huang listened intently as Sabrina explained why she refused to take any more of her medication. He nodded, trying to show Sabrina that he was taking her concerns seriously. Then, when Sabrina stopped talking for a second, he asked her if she'd been experiencing any other changes since all of this started. Sabrina nodded. She said she wasn't very hungry anymore and felt tired and dizzy a lot of the time. She hesitated for a moment, looking sort of embarrassed, then confessed that she'd also been experiencing constipation and hadn't had a bowel movement for 3 days. It was making her stomach feel even more uncomfortable. At this point, Sabrina's mom chimed in and began telling Dr. Huang about all of Sabrina's medical history, from when she was a toddler to now. She talked about her daughter's history of anemia, and also when she was a toddler, she had a condition called pica, in which she would eat foods that were not really foods, but she'd grown out of it, and basically anything she could think of that maybe to some degree was playing a role in what was going on with her now, because no one seemed to know. But after her mother had sort of rattled off everything she could think of, Dr. Huang just sat there silently, having really no idea what was going on with Sabrina. And really nothing that her mother had just told him seemed to be playing a role here. And so the doctor thought, okay, well, maybe she's got some kind of food allergy. Except that her pain was getting steadily worse, which is not typical of allergies. And so Dr. Huang knew he needed to run more tests and take a deeper look into Sabrina's stomach. Dr. Huang told Sabrina and her mother that he was going to order a CT scan of Sabrina's abdomen, just to make sure there wasn't some kind of blockage in her gut. Later that afternoon, Dr. Huang sat at his desk looking over Sabrina's lab work. He was truly stumped. Her CT scan had revealed healthy organs and just a small amount of what looked like stool backed up in her gut. It was all completely normal, and so it allowed him to rule out more serious conditions like gallbladder disease or pancreatitis. The doctor had been wondering if her lab results might reveal an infection, but they came back normal too. In the meantime, Dr. Huang felt confident that he could give Sabrina a few more medications that would help soothe her pain and relieve her constipation without upsetting her stomach further. The doctor took a cup of medications to Sabrina's room and handed them over to her. Sabrina took the cup and stared at the pills like they might be poison. Dr. Huang assured her that none of these meds would make her stomach pain any worse. It was just an antacid pill to help neutralize her stomach acid, an antihistamine to calm her nerves a bit, and a laxative to help with the constipation. He said they were also going to give her an injection of local anesthetic to try to help numb the pain a bit too. Sabrina nodded and gulped the pills down with water. Then Dr. Huang quickly gave her the numbing shot. The doctor threw the needle away and then turned to head back to his office when Sabrina started heaving. He spun back around in time to see the teenager lean forward in her bed, grab a vomit bag, and spew the water and pills she had just swallowed back up. Dr. Huang was shocked. He'd never seen a patient throw up pills that fast. Whatever was plaguing Sabrina had to be a rare condition. He helped Sabrina clean up, then threw away the vomit bag and pressed the call button for the nurse. While they waited, the doctor's mind began to race. To him, the key symptom was how swiftly her stomach pain appeared and disappeared, plus the fact that her abdomen seemed tender all the time. It made him wonder if the issue was in her digestive system, maybe even something called malrotation, a condition where the intestines don't rotate properly during fetal development. It could be causing her issues now that her body was maturing. But as soon as he thought of that, Dr. Huang realized that malrotation couldn't be the problem. It would have shown up in her CT scan. In fact, all the conditions and diseases he could think of would have been revealed by the CT scan or an ultrasound. And the only thing he could see in her digestive tract was the small collection of stool. Once the nurse arrived, Dr. Huang excused himself and headed back up to his office. Once he was there, he sat down at his desk and pulled up Sabrina's medical chart. And as he read it over, he remembered something Sabrina's mother had told him when she went over the entirety of her daughter's medical history. She had told him about a condition that her daughter used to have, but did not have anymore. Dr. Huang had ruled that condition out when he had first heard it, but now he wondered if maybe she still had that condition. Dr. Huang had actually seen that condition before, and he knew it was a tough one to diagnose because oftentimes those suffering from it hid some of their symptoms out of pure embarrassment, which obviously makes diagnosis much more difficult. And so now Dr. Huang wondered if maybe Sabrina was actually still suffering from that condition and knew she was suffering from it, but was simply too embarrassed to say so. But Dr. Huang still felt like there could be something else going on with Sabrina, and so he decided what he would just do is order a simple procedure where a thin, flexible tube with a light and a camera attached to it would be inserted into Sabrina's mouth and would travel down into her stomach, and he could just see for himself what was going on. A few hours later, Dr. Huang watched on a monitor as that camera traveled down Sabrina's esophagus and into her stomach. And immediately, once it was in her stomach, he knew what was causing her pain. Sabrina was suffering from a trichobezoar, or a giant ball of human hair inside of her gut. Stomach acid doesn't readily dissolve hair, so it does not move through the digestive system easily. And so if too much of it gets swallowed, it usually gets lodged in the folds of the stomach's gastric lining. From there, it can trap food and gunk to form this tight, gooey, matted wad. And over time, that wad just gets bigger and bigger. In Sabrina's case, the wad had been showing up on all of her scans, but her doctors had just assumed it was stool. It was not until Dr. Huang remembered Sabrina had pica as a child, which is where the child will eat non-food items. And at that point, Dr. Huang began to suspect that maybe she had continued eating non-food items into her older age, and maybe she had this rare condition called Rapunzel syndrome, where she actually was compulsively ingesting her own hair, causing this trichobezoar to form. Like many people who suffer from Rapunzel syndrome, Sabrina felt ashamed about her condition, which is very likely why she didn't mention it to any of her doctors when she began having this intense stomach pain. In fairness to her, likely she'd been eating her hair for much of her life, since she was a kid, and so she didn't think, this could suddenly cause this huge wad in her stomach now. If it hadn't happened before, why would it happen now? However, Sabrina's condition turned out to be even worse than just a simple hairball. Hair from the tangled mass inside of her had dangled down from her stomach and into her small bowel. Not only did these dangling hairs cause her nausea and pain, they also put her at risk for a host of complications, including perforation of the stomach and intestines and acute pancreatitis. Dr. Huang diagnosed Sabrina in the nick of time. Surgeons were able to remove a hairball about 2.5 inches wide, along with the dangling hair, relieving Sabrina's intense pain and allowing her digestive tract to heal. The doctor also referred Sabrina to a psychiatrist to help with her condition, so that she didn't just develop more hairballs in the future. And now, here's our second story called Sleeping Beauty. On a dreary morning in West Seattle in 2003, 14-year-old Amanda Wu trudged downstairs into the kitchen where her mother, Carol, was making breakfast. Amanda sat down at the table next to her father, Peter, and quickly stifled a yawn. She had not gotten much sleep the night before. She'd woken up feeling achy, and her brain still felt fuzzy. She told her parents she thought she might have the flu. Carol turned around from the stove and gave her daughter a skeptical look. She reminded Amanda that she had tennis practice that afternoon, plus a history test she'd been studying for, so she could only stay home if she had a fever. When her dad didn't come to the rescue, Amanda sighed and stumbled down the hallway to get a thermometer. And as she walked, she felt really clumsy and totally exhausted. But she finally retrieved the thermometer and stuck it under her tongue. By the time she was back in the kitchen, the thermometer was beeping. It was done. And her mother took a look. No fever. She told Amanda, go get ready for school. Amanda's first period that day was English, a class she usually liked. She was a top student, and that day she was even ahead on her reading. But today, she just couldn't seem to focus. She kept losing her place, and the words on the page just looked scrambled. It was like a layer of fog had settled in her brain. She felt like she needed to splash her face with water to wake up. So she raised her hand and asked to go to the bathroom. But then, the next thing she knew, she was lying on a cot in the nurse's office with her worried parents standing over her. Amanda had no idea how she got there. She had no recollection of even leaving her classroom. But then she glanced over at the clock on the wall and saw that over an hour had passed since she had asked to go to the bathroom. She looked from her mom to her dad to the nurse, and then asked what happened. The nurse explained that a couple of her classmates found her passed out on the floor of the girls' bathroom. They tried to shake her awake, but she wouldn't budge. So they'd called for help, and a member of the staff got her to her feet and then walked her down to the nurse's office. The nurse said that Amanda had clearly been groggy, but she had been able to crawl onto the cot by herself. Amanda just blinked in shock. She had no memory of any of that, and this realization sent a chill through her. Had she really been moving around, going about her day while blacked out? But the nurse assured her that very likely she had simply fainted from dehydration, and so she just needed some rest and plenty of fluids. A year later, Amanda's father, Peter, hurried up the stairs to Amanda's room. He'd already called her down to breakfast twice. If she didn't hurry, she'd be late for school. But when he opened his daughter's door, he found Amanda still buried under her covers. She told him she felt too sick to get out of bed, and that her brain felt fuzzy. Over the past few months, his daughter had had a few days like this, where she felt sick and ended up sleeping most of the day, and she always felt better after getting some rest. Plus, Peter remembered last year's fainting episode at school, and so he really didn't want to push her. So he told her to drink some water and just go back to sleep. However, this time wound up being different. By the next morning, Peter was worried. Usually, when Amanda stayed in bed and had sort of a sleepy day because she was sick, she would still come downstairs for meals or to watch a little TV. But the day before, she was out cold until late afternoon, even though he'd tried to wake her up a couple of times. He'd heard her get up maybe once or twice to use the bathroom, but other than that, she'd stayed up there the whole day. Soon, Peter heard movement on the stairs, and a moment later, his daughter walked in. He was about to say good morning, but Amanda just beelined for the fridge, wrenching the door open, and then she began grabbing every bit of food she could find. She raided the cheese drawer, the deli meats, the leftovers. Peter joked with her to slow down, that he was almost done making breakfast, but Amanda totally ignored him. Then she took her pile of food to the living room and flopped onto the couch. But she didn't even turn on the TV. She just began ravenously shoving the food into her mouth. Peter had never seen his daughter act like this. He called for her to come into the kitchen and eat at the table so she didn't make a mess all over the couch. Amanda stopped eating, and slowly she turned and looked back at her father, and in this weird, soft, childlike voice he had never heard before, she told him to leave her alone. And that's when Peter got a really good look at his daughter's face for the first time. Her expression was vacant, and her eyes were seemingly unfocused, like she was in a trance. And then, in that same high-pitched voice, she yelled at her father to go away, and then without warning, she let out this high-pitched scream and dove onto the couch, banging her fists and kicking hysterically, like a toddler throwing a tantrum. Amanda was acting possessed, like something out of a horror movie, and Peter didn't know what to do. But he knew something was seriously wrong, and he needed to get his daughter to the hospital. He called Carol, who had already left for work, and told her they were going to the emergency room. An hour later, Peter was at a loss as he told an ER doctor what had happened that morning. He knew his story made Amanda sound unstable, but he assured the doctor that typically she was a healthy, active, overall very normal kid. She played tennis and basketball, she had friends at school. Her behavior that morning was completely out of character. They were in a cubicle at the ER, where Amanda was sleeping on a hospital bed. She had calmed down in the car on the way over, and then quickly fallen asleep. In fact, she was so out of it that Peter could barely wake her up enough to make it inside the hospital. And now, looking over at his daughter, who was sleeping soundly in the middle of a loud, chaotic emergency room, it was like she was physically incapable of waking up. The ER doctor asked Peter if there had been any other changes to her sleeping patterns over the past few months. Peter admitted that lately, when Amanda felt sick, she could sleep for most of the day. But she was also a teenager now, and teenagers always sleep a lot, so he hadn't thought much of it. The doctor took some notes, and then said he wanted to put Amanda on antidepressants. It sounded like she was struggling, maybe with the transition from junior high to high school, and medication could help. Peter thanked the doctor, and then had to shake Amanda awake and told her it was time to go. She groaned and slowly sat upright. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes were still unfocused. She was so drowsy she could barely hold her head up. Peter bent down and helped his daughter to her feet. He wasn't sure how he was going to tell her that she might be starting antidepressants, especially since Amanda was not usually withdrawn or down. In fact, she was actually a really upbeat kid with an active social life and ambitious college plans. And so deep down, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something else might be going on here, aside from teenage anxiety. But he also wanted Amanda to feel like her old self and have the energy to tackle new adventures. So perhaps the antidepressants were worth a try. Several years later, on a crisp fall day in 2007, Amanda, who was now 18 years old, paddled a canoe across a clear blue lake in northern Minnesota, taking in the stunning scenery all around her. She'd spent the last month on an outdoor survival program called Outward Bound. They'd been in the wilderness for weeks, and so far she'd been having a blast. The program was difficult, but also fun. For the first time in years, Amanda felt like herself again, and now she was beginning the hardest part of the expedition, a final challenge before the program came to an end. She was supposed to spend the next 3 nights camping alone in the wilderness, proving to herself that she was capable of being on her own. By doing this, she felt like she was officially overcoming her health issues. The antidepressants she had been prescribed hadn't really helped. In fact, ever since that hospital visit back in 2004, her sleeping episodes had gotten worse. She would wake up some mornings feeling foggy and sluggish, and then she would realize that days or even weeks had passed by and she basically had no recollection of them. Her parents would tell her that over that period of time, she'd been sleeping for 16 or 18 hours each day. And then when she was awake, she would regress into this weird childlike state. Sometimes when she was like this, she would throw those tantrums. Other times, she would make her parents these little arts and crafts projects, like the ones she did in preschool. But for sure, the weirdest of all of this was the fact that these episodes, which again could go for weeks or months, left her with basically no memory of them. Amanda and her parents had no idea what triggered these episodes or what made them stop. But it was completely disorienting for Amanda. I mean, huge chunks of her life seemed to just be vanishing. I mean, just the previous year, Amanda had come home from a basketball practice, excited for a game the next afternoon. She'd gone to sleep that day, and when she woke up, she found out that 4 months had passed, and she had quit the team. It felt like she was living as 2 different people, a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the doctors also didn't know how to help. They suggested that she very likely had extreme depression combined with some other condition like schizophrenia, but Amanda didn't know what to think. She was depressed, but only because she was missing out on so much of life during these weird spells. It just felt like it was impossible to cope. But when she learned about the Outward Bound program, something about it really spoke to her. Now, to this point, nothing she was doing was really having any positive effect on these sleeping spells. They were still happening, and she still had no control over it. No one knew why they were happening or how to stop them. But for some reason, she just felt like maybe by doing this program and spending a bunch of time outdoors and sort of learning survival skills and sort of being around other people in a natural environment, that would maybe help rebuild her self-confidence. That could be the key to learning how to control this behavioral disorder. And she also felt like by doing this program, she could, show the world that she was still the same ambitious person she had always been. And so far, the program had been working. She'd made it through 30 nights of wilderness living with some instructors and other campers nearby, but for the most part on her own. And so far, she had had no sleeping episodes. She was feeling better and better about herself and wondered if maybe it was this simple. Doing a program like this, being out in nature, was the path back to some kind of normalcy. Amanda's canoe reached the edge of the lake and she disembarked. She wanted to make camp while the sun was still overhead. Amanda dragged her canoe onto the shore, then began setting up her tent. Once it was set up, she unrolled her sleeping bag inside and then set her canister of dried food outside. It was going to be just enough to last for 3 days. Then she closed the front door flap, and settled in for the night. When Amanda opened her eyes, she was still inside of her tent, and even though she couldn't see outside, she could tell it was bright out. Just then, she heard the tent flap rustle, and she thought there was maybe an animal out there, and she sat upright in a panic, but then when the tent flap opened, she saw it was just her instructor. He asked her if she was okay. Amanda nodded and said yeah, she had just woken up, she was fine. Then she stretched and leaned back on her sleeping bag, and she heard something crinkle. She looked down and saw some food wrappers scattered over her sleeping bag. She also saw her food canister was in the tent, and it was empty. All of her food was gone, even though she had no memory of eating it. She suddenly had a sinking feeling in her gut. She looked up at her instructor and asked what day it was. The instructor looked concerned. He told her it was the last morning of her trip and she was way behind schedule. She should be packed up and halfway back to their main camp by now. He'd come to check on her multiple times over the past few days, but she'd always been asleep or so groggy she could barely hold a conversation. He saw that her food was gone by the end of day 1, and he'd been worried about her having enough to eat. Amanda suddenly felt totally relieved to just be alive. I mean, clearly she had just had an episode while she was out in the wild by herself. This wilderness survival idea had been a mistake. She wasn't ready. And if she was ever going to be ready, if she was ever going to get this condition under control and live with any level of independence, she needed to find some real answers about what was going on with her. A few months later, in 2008, a neuroradiologist named Dr. Barney Hughes came out to the waiting room at a medical center in Seattle, Washington. A neuroradiologist is a doctor who uses imagery like X-rays, MRIs, and CT scans to diagnose and treat conditions of the head, brain, spine, and neck. Dr. Hughes walked over to Peter, Carol, and their daughter Amanda, who looked up at him with very groggy eyes. Her hair hung in greasy strands in front of her face. There was a small film crew with the family as well. Amanda's story had got the attention of a documentary crew working on a film about rare illnesses, and they had been documenting her difficult life for the past 6 months. During that time, Dr. Hughes had been observing Amanda. Last week, he'd taken an MRI while she was awake and alert. Then, he had asked Peter and Carol to bring Amanda in the next time she was having a sleeping episode, so they could do another MRI and compare the scans. This morning, her parents had called to say she was in one of her sleeping states, and so they had brought her over to the hospital. Dr. Hughes said hello to Peter and Carol, and then sat down beside Amanda. Secretly, he suspected what her illness might be, but he wanted to see her brain scans first to confirm the diagnosis. He asked Amanda if she was ready for her MRI, and she nodded, but absent-mindedly. Once Amanda was inside the MRI machine, Dr. Hughes asked her to squeeze her left hand into a fist. He wanted to capture her brain activity while she was performing simple tasks. Next, after he had gotten her to do that, he asked Amanda to think of certain words to increase activity in a different part of her brain. This increased activity would light up on the images created by the scanner. And then later that afternoon, Dr. Hughes compared this new MRI image to the one he had taken last week, and what he saw confirmed his diagnosis. Amanda had Klein-Levin syndrome, more commonly known as sleeping beauty disorder. Klein-Levin syndrome, or KLS, is a rare brain disorder linked to problems in the areas of the brain that regulate sleep and behavior, such as the thalamus and hypothalamus. Research suggests that during a KLS episode, these regions don't receive enough blood flow, which may cause excessive sleep and personality changes. Some scientists also believe that a chemical imbalance in the brain plays a role. In Amanda's case, the brain scans confirmed that blood flow to her thalamus dropped by 15% when she was experiencing one of her episodes. And so KLS could explain why she slept up to 20 hours a day during those episodes, and also would experience mood swings and regressions. KLS typically begins in adolescence, with episodes occurring multiple times a year, and Amanda's symptoms fit that pattern. Unfortunately, though, there is no cure for KLS, but the condition usually improves over time, and the episodes become milder and less frequent. In Amanda's case, she would continue having severe episodes until she was 21. Her longest KLS episode was when she woke up one morning and couldn't recall the last 8 months. However, as she grew older, her episodes decreased in severity, and she was better able to manage her condition with the help of medications. On the morning of Friday, May 21st, 2010, 68-year-old Dennis Kola sat down for breakfast with his wife Myrna inside of their kitchen in their spacious 4-bedroom house in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Dennis picked up the newspaper and, like always, began reading the front page out loud to Myrna. This was an activity the couple enjoyed doing together every morning. According to the story on the front page, the stock market was struggling and unemployment was on the rise. But Myrna didn't bat an eye. She knew that she and Dennis would be fine because they had made a ton of money throughout their 42-year marriage by owning multiple successful businesses, from a chain of pharmacies to a Ford car dealership that Dennis owned with his son. But a few years earlier, Dennis had seen the writing on the wall when it came to the country's economy. So he had sold his businesses before things got too bad, and he had walked away with enough money for him and Myrna to be set for the rest of their lives without having to work. But the truth was, Dennis and Myrna actually loved to work, kind of independent of making money, so they weren't quite ready to just full-on retire. And so after selling his companies, Dennis had returned to his old job as a pharmacist, and Myrna worked at a local middle school as a substitute teacher. And so on this Friday morning, because of his work commitments, Dennis didn't have time to read beyond just the first few pages of the newspaper. After putting the paper down, Dennis finished his breakfast, then gave his wife a kiss on the cheek and told her he loved her, and then he walked out the front door. Once outside, Dennis climbed into his truck and began the 40-mile drive to the nearby town where he worked at this local pharmacy. And while Dennis made his commute, Myrna cleaned up the kitchen and then headed out to work herself. And as she drove the short distance to West Salem Middle School, she passed by all these mini mansions that were just like hers, with wide, well-manicured lawns, and then she drove by the neighborhood golf course and banquet hall. Myrna couldn't picture a better place for her and Dennis to grow old together, a small community filled with friends where she always felt comfortable and safe. And she loved how close her neighborhood was to the rest of her family. Dennis and Myrna had 2 grown children who also had children of their own, and Myrna thought there was nothing better than having the family over and spending time with the grandkids she adored. Myrna finally arrived at the middle school, and she went inside and walked down a long hall to the classroom where she had been assigned that day. She opened the door, and the faces of the students lit up. Myrna was the kids' favorite substitute teacher. The school day passed quickly for Myrna, and as always, she made each period pass just as quickly for her students by making sure the lessons were actually fun. Myrna had always believed that learning should be an enjoyable experience and not a slog where every minute feels like an hour. Myrna worked that day at the school until around 3 p.m., and then the final bell rang, and she told her class to have a great weekend, and she said she'd be back as their substitute on Monday. Then Myrna headed outside, hopped in her car, and made her way home, and then once there, she did some chores around the house, and when she was done with her housework, she sat down in the home office and logged onto her computer. About 45 minutes later, around 6 p.m., her husband, Dennis, pulled back up to the house after his day of work. He parked his truck and made his way onto the porch, eager to get inside and have dinner with his wife. Dennis opened the door and walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, his keys dangling from his hand, and then Dennis stepped into the kitchen and called out to his wife. And then suddenly, everything went black. Three days later, on Monday at 7:50 a.m., the morning bell rang at West Salem Middle School, marking the beginning of the official day. Students all took their seats in all the classrooms, and the school kind of went quiet as the teachers began their lessons. That is, in every classroom but one. In that one classroom, the chair behind the teacher's desk remained empty, and so the students in that classroom just remained standing up and chatting with each other, aware of the fact that their teacher was not there, but not that worried because they liked having some extra time. However, these students' obvious restlessness caught the ear of an administrator who happened to be walking by the classroom. And the administrator stepped into the room and asked what was going on, and the students said their substitute teacher still hadn't shown up. Concerned, the administrator told the students to wait quietly, and then he returned to the front office to double-check the schedule. This was the class that Myrna Kola had been assigned to teach that week, and apparently she had just not shown up for work and didn't tell anybody. The administrator pulled up Myrna's file and dialed her phone number, but no one answered. So the administrator checked Myrna's emergency contact info, and he found it was her son, Eric. Eric Kola was home with his wife when he got the phone call from the administrator. Eric told the administrator that he had no idea why his mom wouldn't show up for work, but he told him he'd try to get in touch with her and report back as soon as he could. Eric hung up and dialed his mom's cell phone, but it just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. So Eric called his father, who at this point in the morning would have been in his truck on his way to work, and so in theory would have been ready to receive a phone call, but he too did not answer his phone. After both parents didn't pick up, Eric turned to his wife looking concerned and said something wasn't right, that this was totally out of character for his parents to just go completely incommunicado. And so Eric called his sister, Cindy, and asked her if she had had any contact with their parents, but Cindy said that she hadn't talked to them since before the weekend. After Eric ended this call, he told his wife that he was just going to go to his parents' house to see what the heck was going on. And about 10 minutes later, Eric slowed his truck to a stop in front of the house, and he saw his dad's truck was out front. Eric parked, walked up the driveway to the side of the house, and he looked into his parents' 3-car garage. And he could see his mother's car, a Mountaineer, was also parked inside, so his parents had to be home. Eric opened the garage with the opener his parents had given him, he walked past his mother's SUV, and then he opened the unlocked door to the house and stepped inside. And as he walked towards the kitchen, he saw his father. Dennis was lying there, motionless on the kitchen floor. Eric ran to his father, and he saw there was a pool of blood all around him. Eric got down on the floor and grabbed his dad's leg, desperately trying to shake him awake. But not only was Dennis unresponsive, his body was totally stiff. And so in a panic, Eric grabbed his phone and dialed 911, and when the operator answered, he told them as best as he could what he had seen, and the operator, who was very calm, asked Eric if anyone else was in the house. And so Eric, who didn't know, began walking down the hall, and when he looked into the office, he cried out. There was his mother, slumped over the desk at the computer. Her skin had turned purple. The operator calmly asked Eric if his mother was still breathing, and Eric replied that no, she wasn't, that both of his parents had to be dead. A little while after Eric's 911 call, Agent John Christopherson of the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation and members of his team arrived at the Colas house. Christopherson saw 2 deputies from the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department talking to Eric in the front yard. And he saw several of the Colas neighbors standing on their porches, looking completely stunned by all the police activity. I mean, this stuff didn't happen in this neighborhood. Christopherson knew major crime was rare in this community, and a double homicide was basically unheard of. That was a big reason Christopherson and the state police had been brought in to lead this investigation. Agent Christopherson got out of his car, walked across the yard, and introduced himself to the deputies and to Eric. And he let them both know that he'd be back soon to ask some questions. Then he led members of his team into the Colas house. The smell of decomposing bodies hit them immediately, and the smell instantly told them that the victims must have been dead for quite a while. Christopherson walked to the kitchen, and he saw Dennis lying face down on the floor. Dennis was surrounded by a pool of coagulated blood, and he had a hole in the right side of his head. Dennis was still wearing his jacket, and his car keys were clutched tightly in his hand. So Christopherson figured that Dennis must have been shot shortly after he walked through the front door of his house. After looking around the kitchen, Christopherson walked down the hall to the office, where he knew the second victim had been found. He saw Myrna's body hunched over the desk. She had an obvious bullet wound in the back of her head, and her left arm was resting on the computer keyboard, as if she had been typing when someone walked up behind her and shot her. Christopherson turned around and glanced back at the office door. He wondered if the killer had stood there and watched this woman at her computer before shooting her. There was something cold-blooded about the idea, like a predator observing its prey before moving in for the kill. While Christopherson searched the office, a member of the investigative team walked inside and told Christopherson that he needed to see something upstairs. So Christopherson followed the officer up a carpeted staircase, down a hallway, and into Myrna and Dennis's bedroom. It appeared like the room had been ransacked. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, but as Christopherson walked across the room to the dresser, he felt like there was something unusual about the bedroom scene. Their dresser drawers had all been pulled out and left open in a way that a robber wouldn't have actually been able to see what was in each drawer, and it didn't look like anyone had actually dug through the drawers or taken anything. So Christopherson wondered if maybe the killer had tried to stage the room to look like a robbery, even though that's not what it was. Christopherson continued to walk around the room, and he quickly found pieces of Myrna's very expensive jewelry just sitting out, untouched, so that only added to his suspicion that the apparent ransacking in the bedroom really had been staged. Christopherson finished searching the room and then made his way down the hall to an upstairs guest room. This room looked untouched. But then, when he opened the door to a walk-in closet inside of this room, something immediately caught the agent's eye. It was a .22 caliber rifle propped up against the wall. Christopherson looked up, and he saw, on a shelf right above the rifle, was an opened box of ammunition. He kneeled down to look closer at the rifle, and he noticed there was an indentation in the carpet nearby that was about the same size and shape as the butt of the gun. It looked like the indentation was where the rifle had been resting, but then just recently, someone must have moved that rifle, and when they returned it, they didn't put it back exactly where they'd found it, in the indentation. Christofferson had a member of his team bag the rifle and the box of ammunition and book them into evidence. Then, Christofferson headed downstairs and outside and joined the deputies who were talking to Eric. After telling Eric how sorry he was for his loss, Christofferson said, "Look, I have to ask you right now about what you know, because this is a murder investigation and this needs to move quickly." And so he asked Eric when was the last time he saw his parents alive. Eric said it had been Thursday night, so 4 nights earlier. He had stopped by the house to help his mother do laundry and to help his father replace some boards out on the deck. And before Eric left, Eric told Christofferson that his father had said to him, "I love you, son." And Eric had said back, "Yeah, I love you too, Dad." He said that was the last time they actually spoke. Eric did tell Christofferson that weekend he had tried calling his parents to invite them to a cookout, but they didn't pick up, so he left a voicemail, and his parents didn't call him back, but he didn't think it was that big of a deal because he knew his parents had plans with friends that weekend. After hearing this, Christofferson asked Eric if he knew of anyone who might have access to his parents' residence. Eric said he couldn't think of anyone specifically, but he did say his parents often kept their doors unlocked. This didn't really surprise Christofferson because that's how safe this community was. But now he wondered if maybe someone had exploited that sense of security and just slipped inside the house through an unlocked door. As Eric continued to speak with Christofferson and the other police officers, Eric's sister, Cindy Cowell, arrived at the property. And as she walked across the yard towards them, Christofferson could tell she'd been crying. After Cindy walked over to them, she gave her brother a hug, and the two of them did their best to comfort each other and also to provide any additional information that might help. But neither of them could think of anyone who might have had a motive to kill their parents. And so this double murder was turning into a total mystery. The next day, the medical examiner performed autopsies on Dennis and Myrna, and the results were far from surprising. Each had been shot in the head. But there was an important detail. The bullet that had struck them in the head was a .22 caliber bullet. And this was an important detail for Christofferson because it was the same caliber bullet used in the rifle he'd found in the upstairs bedroom closet. And that rifle had clearly been recently moved because of that indentation he saw in the carpet. And Christofferson thought that if that rifle was the murder weapon, then the killer had to have known Dennis and Myrna well enough to know where they kept that gun. Christofferson wanted to develop a timeline of the Colas' last day. However, the autopsies did not pinpoint the exact times of their deaths, so he still wasn't even sure what day they had died. But one thing he did know was that Myrna had clearly been using her computer when she was killed, so his team sent Myrna's computer to a forensic data lab where the hard drive could be analyzed for timestamps. And this data revealed that Myrna had begun using her computer at exactly 5:14 p.m. on Friday, May 21st, and her very last keystroke was made at 5:41 p.m. that same evening. And so Christofferson believed that 5:41 p.m. on May 21st was the exact time of Myrna's death. Then Christofferson, using this information, figured out when Dennis had left work on that day and how long generally it would take Dennis to drive back home. And based on this, Christofferson concluded that Dennis most likely got home around 6 p.m. So he estimated that Dennis's time of death was about 20 minutes after his wife's death. So at this point, Christofferson knew that the Colas had very likely been killed in the early evening of May 21st, 3 days before they were actually discovered. And also, based on the timeline, whoever had shot Myrna had very likely waited inside of the house to then kill Dennis when he walked inside. Christofferson knew that Dennis and Myrna were well off financially, and they had multiple investments and life insurance policies with very big payouts, so money had to be considered as a potential motive. And investigators soon learned that the beneficiaries of Dennis and Myrna's life insurance policies were their kids, Eric and Cindy, and they stood to inherit over $700,000 each. And so obviously when you include the fact that Eric was the one who found the bodies, this made the kids highly suspicious. And so Christofferson decided he would speak to them both, but he would start with Eric. And so the day after the discovery of the bodies, Eric arrived at the police station and he sat down across from Christofferson inside of a small interview room. And Eric appeared to be very grief-stricken, but at the same time, Christofferson could tell Eric was eager to help. He spoke in a cooperative tone and never came across as defensive. And so the first question Kristofferson asked Eric was, how was his relationship with his parents? Eric said he had always gotten along with both of his parents. He said his father was a great business partner because they worked at that car dealership together, and also they played golf together all the time. Eric said he also made a point to see his mother as much as he could and also help her out around the house because she refused to slow down even though she was almost 70. After that, Kristofferson asked Eric to walk him through what he did all day on Friday, May 21st, which is again the day that Kristofferson believed the two victims were killed. Eric said that day he spent the morning and afternoon doing what he normally did, day trading. Day trading is a form of securities trading where the trader buys stocks and other assets and then sells them the same day, taking advantage of price fluctuations that occur between the opening and closing of the trading day. And Eric would say he was actually a pretty successful day trader, often pulling in between $7,000 and $10,000 a month. The only downside being that it required him to sit at home on his computer for hours and hours on end. After he finally got up from his computer, he left his house to meet up with his friend to help grout and tile a shower. He said he was with that friend until about 5:30 p.m., and then he went to pick up his wife at home because they were going out to celebrate their 16th wedding anniversary. Now, to this point in the interview, it was very cut and dry. Eric is doing his best to be composed, but at this point, Eric just suddenly shook his head and began laughing. Kristofferson was very surprised at this and asked, did I miss something funny? Eric stopped laughing and said, it's not really funny, but I had known about this day, our anniversary, for a long time. We had planned it all out. But as I was going back home that day, I actually realized I totally forgot to buy an actual anniversary gift. And so Eric would explain that he stopped at a retail store called Shopko to buy his wife a hanging plant because he knew his wife loved hanging plants, and he also knew the exact type to get her. And so Eric said he went inside the shop and he browsed the store's garden center for a while, but he didn't actually see the plant that his wife liked. So he drove to a different Shopko location, and he did find the right hanging plant there. And he paid for it and then drove home, and then he and his wife had gone out for their celebration. And then right after he said that, Eric looked like he had just remembered something out of the blue. And he pulled his wallet out and he took out a receipt for this plant and he slid it across the table to Kristofferson, saying that he had held on to this receipt in case his wife didn't like the plant and so she could return it. Kristofferson looked at the receipt and it did confirm that Eric had bought this plant at 6:15 p.m. at the Shopko. After that, Kristofferson asked Eric to wait in the interview room while he reached out to Eric's friend to confirm that they really had met up on that Friday to grout and tile the bathroom. And so Kristofferson got the friend's number, stepped into the hall, and gave him a call, and the friend confirmed that Eric had left his house around 5:30 that evening. And so at this point, Kristofferson concluded that based on Eric's timeline, he didn't really have enough time to have also driven to his parents' house to kill them, between leaving his friend's house and then getting that plant at Shopko. So Kristofferson did not think Eric was as likely of a suspect as he originally seemed. So Kristofferson walked back into the interview room and asked Eric if he could think of anyone at all, who may have had a reason to harm his parents. Eric hesitated, and then with obvious reluctance in his voice, he said they should look into his sister, Cindy, and her husband, Patrick. When asked to explain why, Eric said that Cindy had been having some very serious financial problems. She was living paycheck to paycheck, earning close to minimum wage, working for a collections agency. Meanwhile, her husband, Patrick, didn't work at all. They had a mortgage and other expenses, and Cindy had been borrowing money from their parents to help make ends meet. In fact, she actually owed her parents tens of thousands of dollars. And then also, Eric said that his sister's husband, Patrick, was just generally kind of a bad guy. And also, Eric knew his parents did not like Patrick at all and often referred to him as a, quote, lazy bum. But Eric said he wasn't sure if his parents even knew just how bad things really were between Cindy and her husband, Patrick. Eric said Patrick had a violent temper and had once pulled a gun on Cindy after she threatened to leave him. Patrick allegedly told Cindy that the only way she'd be leaving him was in a body bag. Kristofferson was shocked at this information. If this was true, this was a huge red flag. The idea that Patrick had literally pulled a gun out and actually threatened to kill someone certainly made him a pretty big suspect. But Kristofferson kind of tempered his reaction to this and just thanked Eric for coming in and speaking to him. And then after Eric was gone, Kristofferson immediately reached out to Cindy to set up a meeting. The following day, Cindy showed up at the station and joined Kristofferson in the interview room. And right away, Kristofferson could tell Cindy seemed very rattled and sort of nervous. But Kristofferson didn't react to that and just thanked her for coming in and reiterated how sorry he was for her loss. His voice was calm and friendly, and he told Cindy there was no reason to be nervous. This was just an interview, not an interrogation. Cindy nodded, but still seemed very nervous. Christofferson began the interview by asking Cindy when was the last time she spoke to her parents, and Cindy said she'd spoken to her father on Friday morning, so the day that Dennis and Myrna were killed. Cindy said during this conversation with her dad, she had talked about her and her husband's mounting financial troubles. She had told her father that she and Patrick had absolutely no money, and to make matters worse, the unemployment check that Patrick was expecting hadn't arrived yet. Cindy said her father had been sort of blunt with her that morning. He criticized her husband for not supporting her and their daughter, and then he told Cindy he would not keep giving her any more money. Cindy looked like she was about to cry. She told Christofferson that her father's rejection was so upsetting for her, and she felt like Eric was the favorite child, the golden boy, while she was just a disappointment to her parents. After that, Christofferson asked her what she had done the rest of that day after she had spoken to her father. Cindy said she'd been at work until about 4:45 p.m. She left the office and stopped at a convenience store to buy some groceries, and then she got home between 5:30 and 6. And once she was home, she spent the rest of the evening with her daughter and husband. Christofferson took down Cindy's work information and said that was all he needed from her for now, and that he would follow up if necessary. After the interview, members of the investigative team went to Cindy's office and obtained her punch cards. And the punch cards would show that yes, Cindy had clocked out at 4:45 p.m. Next, they drove over to the convenience store where Cindy said she had done her grocery shopping, and the manager of that store gave them access to the surveillance footage from that day, and it didn't take investigators long to find Cindy in the video, shopping in the store during the time frame she said she was. And so, just like with her brother, the investigators concluded that basically based on the timeline, there wasn't enough time for Cindy to have gone to her parents' house and killed them. But Agent Christofferson couldn't completely rule Cindy out yet. Even if she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, what's to say her husband, Patrick, the man who apparently had, a temper and had previously drawn a gun on Cindy and threatened her life, who's to say he didn't pull the trigger? And also maybe Cindy was involved somehow with the murder, that she helped coordinate it for Patrick. But before Christofferson jumped to that conclusion and brought Patrick in and really drilled him hard on what he was doing on that day, he first wanted to check to see if Eric's description of Patrick was actually accurate. And what Christofferson learned was Patrick had apparently cheated on Cindy at some point, he abused drugs, and he had difficulty holding down jobs. And because he was currently unemployed, he had a lot of free time and not a lot of money. Christofferson also learned that Myrna did not like Patrick so much that she had warned Cindy that if she stayed married to Patrick, there's a chance that she would just deny her getting her inheritance, that basically Patrick could not touch this money, and that was the reason she wouldn't be getting it. And Patrick was definitely aware of this, and also he was aware that Cindy's parents were apparently about to cut them both off financially. And so it did seem like Patrick had more motive to want Dennis and Myrna dead than anybody else. A few days after the murders, Christofferson, along with an investigator from the sheriff's department, waited for Patrick inside of an interview room. Eventually, another officer led Patrick into the room, and Patrick sat down on the other side of the table. Patrick was very physically imposing. He was tall with broad shoulders, and he had short cropped hair, and he had spent some time in the Marine Corps. But once he was settled in his seat, he made it very clear that he wanted to help the investigators in any way he could. And the investigators actually couldn't help but look at each other really quickly, like they couldn't believe how soft-spoken Patrick seemed. I mean, this guy had this horrible reputation, and right now, he seemed like he was just very cooperative. But Christofferson knew looks can be deceiving, so he got right to the point, and he asked Patrick how he spent his day on Friday, May 21st, the day his in-laws were killed. And Patrick said in a very soft voice that he had spent the day just kind of hanging around the house by himself, watching TV and playing Xbox. After this, the county investigator said to Patrick, that's not exactly an airtight alibi. If he was home by himself, how could anybody corroborate that? Patrick said he understood, but he really was telling the truth. That's what he did on Friday. And then he also said he always had a great relationship with Dennis and Myrna, and he would never do anything to hurt them or to cause his wife any pain. At this point, Christofferson was nearly certain that Patrick was just lying, because basically everyone they had spoken to had said that the in-laws did not get along with Patrick. They called him the lazy bum, and they totally resented him and did not like him. So how could he possibly have a good relationship with them? And so Christofferson didn't waste any time. He leaned in and told Patrick that police had heard his relationship with the victims had been strained, to say the least, and so it seemed very likely that right now, Patrick was lying. Christofferson also pointed out Patrick's weak alibi and the fact that as a former Marine, he would know how to use a gun. Patrick didn't deny any of this and said he did own several firearms, but he said again that he really had been at home playing video games that past Friday, and he really didn't have anything to do with the murders. Christofferson told Patrick that they might have a better idea if he really was telling the truth if he allowed them to search his house. Patrick looked at both investigators, and his voice stayed calm and soft like it had the whole time, and he said yes, he would consent to a search of his home because he had nothing to hide. So not long after this interview, investigators did search Patrick and Cindy's house, and they would find multiple firearms which were confiscated. They also seized Patrick's Xbox and brought it into the crime lab for analysis. Investigators were able to see exactly when the Xbox game console was being used, and it did seem to confirm everything Patrick had said, because the Xbox had been used all day on Friday, suggesting Patrick really had been at home playing video games at the time Myrna and Dennis were murdered. And also, after closer analysis, the guns seized in Patrick and Cindy's house were not the same ones that fired the .22 caliber bullets that killed Dennis and Myrna. And so, just like Eric and Cindy, Patrick suddenly had a solid alibi. The following day, Eric walked outside of his house, he opened up his mailbox, and he found a single item inside. It was a plain white envelope with no postage on it. Eric took the envelope inside of his house, he opened it up, and he looked at the paper that was inside. And when Eric saw what was on it, his face turned pale and he started breathing heavily. His wife walked into the room and saw Eric staring at this note and clenching his jaw and shaking his head, and she asked him, "What's going on? What does the note say?" Eric walked over to his wife and just held the note out for her to read. And in strange, weirdly stilted handwriting were the words, "Fixed you." That's all it said, "Fixed you." Eric's wife immediately picked up her phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the house and took this strange note into evidence. And also the deputy noticed that Eric was incredibly rattled and could barely talk. In fact, the sheriff's deputy said it seemed like Eric could actually have a heart attack. And as Eric tried to catch his breath, he would tell the deputy that he believed his parents' killer wrote this note, and somehow those two words, "fixed you," meant they were coming for him and his family next. The note forced Christofferson to view this case from a totally new angle. If somebody really did have a vendetta against the Colas, and that's why they killed Dennis and Myrna, it did seem entirely possible that they might also target the rest of the Cola family. And so that possibility obviously put way more pressure on Christofferson and his team to solve this case quickly. But the only thing that Christofferson kept coming back to that just seemed like it had to be at the heart of this case was money. Not only did Dennis and Myrna have property, investments, and huge insurance policies before they died, but also Eric had been a successful day trader and had lots of money too. So Christofferson decided he would dig deep as he could into the family's finances, hoping that might point him to a potential killer. And so back at the station, Christofferson and a forensic accountant dug through stacks of Dennis and Myrna's printed bank statements, and also they reviewed the couple's most recent online banking transactions. And as they looked at that recent online activity, something absolutely shocked them. And at first, Christofferson literally couldn't believe what he was looking at, like this had to be a mistake, because it was something so outlandish, it just shouldn't have been there. There was a transaction made on May 22nd, 2010, the day after the murders. The transaction showed a check that was cashed from Dennis's account for $50,000. Now, the name on the signature line of the check was Dennis Cola, but it was the name on the account that this check had been deposited into that really caught the investigators' attention. And suddenly the whole focus of the investigation shifted. Police immediately served a search warrant on this particular person's house, and inside they found a pair of plain white envelopes very similar to the envelope that Eric had found in his mailbox that contained the words "fixed you" on it. And when those envelopes were compared to the one that Eric had received, they contained the same manufacturing defect, proving that the envelope containing that "fixed you" note had come from this individual's house. Then a forensic document examiner looked at that $50,000 check, and he quickly determined that Dennis's signature on this check was a forgery. What's more, the forged handwriting perfectly matched the handwriting on the "fixed you" note. And so now Agent Christofferson was very confident that the person who wrote that note and then also forged the check was Dennis and Myrna's killer. Based on financial records, evidence from the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Dennis and Myrna Cola on May 21st, 2010. Around 5:30 p.m., the killer, who was inside of the Cola's house at this point, slowly walked down the hallway in the direction of the home office. They watched Myrna from the hall until they were sure she was totally preoccupied with what she was doing on her computer. Then the killer slowly walked upstairs, entered one of the bedrooms, opened the closet door, and lifted the .22 caliber rifle from where it was resting on the floor. They also reached up and grabbed some ammo from the box on the shelf, then loaded the rifle and walked back downstairs. Then the killer made their way back to the home office, and they looked inside and saw Myrna was still preoccupied with the computer. And so the killer stepped forward into the room, they raised the rifle, aimed it at Myrna's head, and then pulled the trigger. A .22 caliber bullet lodged in Myrna's brain. She died instantly, slumping over her computer, with her fingers still near the last keys she had pressed. Confident that Myrna was dead, the killer crossed the room and closed the blinds. Then they walked back into the hallway, went down to the kitchen, and sat down at the table, and began to wait. About 20 minutes later, the killer heard Dennis's truck pull up outside. The killer heard the sound of the truck door opening and closing, and then the sounds of footsteps getting louder as Dennis approached the front of the house. At this point, the killer slowly got up and moved towards the back of the kitchen and put their back against the wall, sort of out of view, and continued to wait. A moment later, the killer heard Dennis's footsteps now inside of the house, his keys jangling in his hand. Then the killer saw Dennis walk into the kitchen, and immediately they raised their rifle, aimed it at Dennis's head, and fired. Dennis was dead before he even hit the ground. The killer stared at the body on the floor, and then walked back upstairs and returned the rifle to the closet, failing to notice they were not placing it in the exact spot where it had been before. After that, the killer walked to Dennis and Myrna's bedroom and opened up the dresser drawers to make it look like the home had been robbed. Then the killer opened up the drawer on the nightstand, tore out a check from Dennis's checkbook, and then wrote themselves a $50,000 check and forged Dennis's signature. The killer slipped the check into their pocket, walked back downstairs, left the house, and drove to a Shopko store to buy a hanging plant for an anniversary gift, making sure to keep the receipt to help corroborate the alibi they knew they would need. Dennis and Myrna's own son, Eric Cola, had been their killer. It would turn out Eric had only visited one Shopko store that day to buy a plant, not the two stores like he had told police. And so when detectives obtained the surveillance footage from the Shopko Eric claimed to have visited first, before going to the second one and buying the plant, well, they expected to see him browsing the garden center in this first shop, but the investigators spent hours and hours reviewing the footage from multiple cameras inside and outside the store, but there was no trace of Eric anywhere. And investigators knew that if he had not gone to that store and only went to the second one, well, he would easily have enough time to kill his parents. And so his alibi began to fall apart. And then, when investigators delved deeper into the Cola's financial records, they found that forged $50,000 check, and it was made out to Eric. And then also, when investigators began probing Eric's personal finances, they quickly discovered that Eric had been lying to them. Eric was not raking in $7,000 to $10,000 a month from day trading as he claimed. In fact, he was in serious financial trouble. His day trading had been successful in the beginning, but then the economy had tanked, and Eric's financial position plummeted, leaving him desperately broke and $150,000 in debt. But Eric continued keeping up appearances. He drove luxury cars, spoiled his kids, and retained membership at an exclusive country club. He presented himself to friends as this financial wizard, but all the while, he was actually borrowing huge sums of money from his father and then losing it on the stock market. Investigators had learned from Dennis's colleagues that Dennis was an extraordinarily generous man, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back if he thought you were in need. But Dennis's generosity had its limits. He had reached the end of his rope with his kids because he had given Eric hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he had helped pay Cindy's mortgage while her husband sat at home unemployed playing video games. And in fact, only days before the murders, Dennis had told a work colleague at the pharmacy that he was officially cutting off his children financially. Enough was enough. When police confronted Eric about the forged $50,000 check, Eric explained that his father had given him a blank check the day before he was killed, and Eric had deposited it on Saturday, having no idea his parents were dead. But police didn't believe that, because Dennis had just told his colleague that he planned to stop giving his children money. So police searched Eric's home, and they found the envelopes that matched the envelope from the Fixed You note. Eric had written that note himself and put it in his own mailbox. And so by this point, police were very sure Eric had killed his parents, and they had enough probable cause to arrest him. Police believe Eric Cola murdered his mother and father just so he could use the inheritance money to pull himself out of debt. The case against Eric was entirely circumstantial, but it was strong enough that a jury found him guilty on 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Eric did not receive a dime of his parents' estate, but his 2 children did inherit $740,000, which they split between them. Eric continues to maintain his innocence.
With nothing but borrowed plans, stayed up late talking about dreams we didn't quite understand. We ran on hope and cheap coffee, believed time was on our side. Didn't know growing up meant some parts of us stay behind. Funny how fast the years fly when you think you've got forever. Now I look back and wonder if we ever knew better. We were almost who we wanted to be, almost fearless, almost free. We were standing at the start of it all, with nowhere to fall. Yeah, we were young and unfinished, of unfinished echoes. Show me where the lost truth goes. Guide me through your heated throes, past the doubts my spirit knows. Desert, let your endless flows shape the self my shadow chose. Footprints shimmer under solar flame, vanishing before they earn a name. Still the silence speaks without a claim, teaching me I'm never quite the same. Every shifting golden sand.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories, and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen